Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome to Ream Library. Thanks for coming out tonight. I'm Tom Lenny. I'm the director of the McFarland Center for Religion, Ethics, and Culture here at the college. The McFarland Center sponsors and supports programs that explore basic human questions of meaning, morality, and mutual obligation. Tonight's talk is supported by the Kraft-Hiatt Program for Jewish-Christian Understanding, a program established through the generosity of the late Jacob Hiatt and his wife Frances, and Robert and Myra Kraft. You can learn more about our events or watch past lectures online at holycross.edu/McFarland Center, so tell your friends what they missed, and in a couple days they can watch online. Before I introduce our guest tonight, I would like to welcome one special guest, our friend Rabbi Norman Cohen of the class of 72. Rabbi Norman is a great friend of the college and also of tonight's speaker, and was helpful to me when we were planning all of this, so I'm grateful to him for that. It's really a great honor for me tonight to welcome Rabbi David Saperstein, the United States Ambassador at Large for International Religious Freedom, to speak about U.S. efforts to promote religious freedom around the world. Ambassador Saperstein is Principal Advisor to President Barack Obama and Secretary of State John Kerry. He serves as the United States Chief Diplomat on issues of religious freedom worldwide. He also heads the Office of International Religious Freedom in the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor, and he's charged with carrying out the Near East and South Central Asia Religious Freedom Act of 2014. Ambassador Saperstein was once named the most influential rabbi in America, served for 40 years as director of the Religious Action Center of Reform Judaism, overseeing national social justice programming for the largest movement of American Jewry. During that time, Rabbi Saperstein headed several national religious coalitions, including the Coalition to Protect Religious Liberty. He served on the boards of a number of organizations, including the NAACP, the National Religious Partnership on the Environment, the National Religious, and the World Bank's World Faiths Development Dialogue. Aside from having the titles Rabbi and Ambassador, we also can note that Ambassador Saperstein is an attorney and a professor, so I'll leave you to decide which are the higher of those callings. Ambassador Saperstein taught seminars in First Amendment church-state law and in Jewish law for 35 years at Georgetown University Law Center. A prolific writer and speaker, Ambassador Saperstein has appeared in numerous television, news, and talk shows. He was on WGBH this morning out of Boston. His articles have been published in the Washington Post, the New York Times, and the Harvard Law Review. His latest book is Jewish Dimensions of Social Justice, Tough Moral Choices for Our Time. Please join me in welcoming Ambassador David Saperstein.
Well, thank you for the introduction, for the invitation to be at this extraordinary college known for its academics, its ethics, its focus on ethics as a discipline, and I'm really honored and pleased to be here. Mr. President, I'm glad to see you here. If I have my choice, well, I won't say this, but here. Tom, I'm really delighted and to learn about the work of your center, and I really appreciate what you've done. And my dear friend Norman Cohen, I'm really always pleased to be here. Your commitment to this school is deeply touching, and I begin to understand a little better why, having spent time these last few hours here. I've been asked to speak tonight about the state of religious freedom around the world. Let me just offer a little bit of context in terms of why this is so important to America. It is many of the founders of our country themselves who had fled religious persecution. And in creating the legal structure of our country, in our Constitution, set forth three foundational principles dealing with religious freedom. And when taken together, and this is often overlooked, offered a revolutionary notion of the relationship of the individual and the state, particularly in terms of religion. So the three provisions are obviously the two provisions that constitute what we call the first freedom of our Bill of Rights. That is free exercise of religion, no establishment of religion. It required government neutrality on religion, keeping the government out of religion. And the other is the Article 6 bar against a religious test for office. And when you take the three of them together, they constitute a revolutionary notion in the history of human political forms. For it asserted that this would be a country in which one's rights as a citizen would not depend upon their religious identity, their religious practices, their religious belief. There had never been a country like that before. And like many of our aspirational values in our founding documents, we didn't get there instantly. There were religious establishments in a number of the colonies, states that had been the New England colonies that reached into the 1830s. There were some legal constraints against different people of different religions, but in the main, it was an idea that grew and grew and grew until by the 1940s, and then again in the 50s and 60s, it was enshrined into the constitutional interpretations of the Supreme Court of the United States and became a reality. And that was the time that the international covenants, that is the basis for our international work. I serve as ambassador at large. That's a fancy title of saying an ambassador not just to one country, but ambassador with global responsibilities. So I serve as ambassador at large for international religious freedom, which means I don't deal with religious freedoms issues here in the United States, but I do deal with them in every other country across the globe. And the structure that created my office includes an annual report on every country in the world. It includes the program efforts that we engage in on behalf of religious freedom. I will talk more about these in just a moment here. But those foundational documents, international treaties, which were written in the 20th century, were in turn inspired by America's understanding of religious freedom. And that test that one's rights as a citizen would not depend on their religious identity, beliefs, or practices still remains a useful rule in assessing how deep is the commitment to religious freedom of any country. Now, protecting, and this is all embodied in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights, in Article 18. Now, Article 18 is a very robust standard of religious freedom. It doesn't just say there's freedom of religion, free exercise of religion. It goes into some detail, and it includes not only worship, but religious practices, religious preaching, religious teaching to your children, the right of every person to choose their religion, the right of every person to change their religion is expressly protected in Article 18 of the Universal Declaration and the ICCPR. What is also different about the United States, however, is there is a limiting phrase in the ICCPR that indicates that freedom of religion can be limited by public safety, order, health, or morals, or the fundamental rights and freedom, or the fundamental rights and freedom of others. The vagueness of that limiting phrase is a source of great tension, in which those countries who wish to restrain religious freedom, particularly minority groups whose views the majority of the country feel troubled by, is justified. Well, if they say that, they're going to provoke the majority to strike out at them, and therefore we have to control what they say or what they write or how they worship in a certain way. And clearly that was not the intent of the Universal Declaration or of the ICCPR, but that tension is a source of many of the restrictions that we find in countries across the globe. Now, we assert religious freedom not only because it is a fundamental right in and of itself, but because we really, truly believe, in terms of American statecraft and foreign policy and national security, that countries that offer religious freedom tend to be the more stable countries, the more prosperous countries, and the freer countries on other issues in general. At the core of religious freedom is freedom of conscience. And freedom of conscience is the foundation for freedom of speech, freedom of protest, freedom of the press. All of that is based on the ability of people to write, to say, to profess, to argue for, to advocate for, petition the government for redress of grievances, to advocate for what their conscience says is the right thing for them to do. And we have always said that if a country is divided along religious lines and ends up in sectarian violence, it will be a less free, less prosperous, less stable country. If the majority is willing to repress the minority, or the government represses the minority, and does so for the sake of, let's say, national security, that they're worried that extremists may be infiltrating a religious group, that a religious group might want to break away and have an autonomous region separate from the rest of the country. If that's what they are fearful of, and they respond to it by restricting or repressing peaceful exercise of religion of an entire group, then all the country is going to succeed in doing is driving religious life underground, which makes it less transparent to the government, will result in more public suspicion about the group they can't see anymore, what they're doing, and make the government more suspicious. And that will lead to further restrictions. And if the frustration and despair of the minority group that's been targeted by the government gets them angry enough, or gets them to give up hope they can live with their conscience and by the law of the land, then that kind of frustration and despair becomes a fertile field for extremists to move in and say to that oppressed, persecuted minority, you're never going to get the ability to live in accordance with the law of the land and your conscience. Work with us, we'll change the system. So the very thing that was sought for by the government that engages in repression, often when it results in the repression and persecution of religious groups, ends up destabilizing a country. And no country is divided along sectarian lines that relegates segments of its population to second-class citizenship is ever going to be a stable country, and a country that will be able to implement freedoms for all its people. And therefore, this is a matter of national security interest to us, as well as matter of fundamental principle for us. So let me explain how we in the United States government go about this work and the work of my office. With the First Amendment Universal Declaration, ICCPR in mind, the Congress of the United States passed the International Religious Freedom Act, or IRF Act, in 1998. And it did create the office that I'm honored to run within the State Department, the position that I hold, but also a watchdog committee called the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom that kind of watches how we do our work and makes recommendations to the State Department and the White House how we can do better, and mandated the annual report. So let me just mention some of the tools that we use in pursuing religious freedom, the diplomatic tools that we use. First, we monitor and we report. Our annual report factually and objectively details the state of religious freedom in 199 countries and territories. We take great pride in the fact that local civil society organizations often use our report as an advocacy tool. Many other governments have adopted our report and send it out to their foreign service officers in embassies across the globe and say, here's your blueprint of the groups that are repressed or persecuted in the country in which you're serving. Reach out to these people. See what you can do to help. I just returned from Malaysia. Malaysia is one of 4 countries that makes the practice of any form of Islam other than Sunni Islam illegal. Malaysia, Morocco, Brunei, and the Maldives. All ban anything other than Sunni Islam. There are other countries, Saudi Arabia, in which Sunni Islam is the favored expression of Islam, but Shia Muslims can organize their own religious life and practice, and of course they may face obstacles, but their practice of the religion is not barred under the law. And I met with the leaders of the Shia community. I met with human rights lawyers who defended their rights, and I heard what I hear over and over again from persecuted groups. And we're talking about 1,000 Shia and 30 million people. Said, we're all alone, we're vulnerable. We never knew that anyone even knew about us. And here you are putting out our story to the entire world. Can't tell you how this strengthens us, gives us resolve to fight for our rights, sustains us in bad times. The human rights lawyer said, and we use your report whenever we go to court to fight for the rights of the different minority groups. We introduce your report as evidence of the kind of restriction of freedom that exists for the minority groups in this country. It's a very proud feeling to know that that's the case. Now, and the fact is, and think about this for a moment, over 200 Foreign Service officers have primary responsibility in all the major embassies and in some of the consulates around the world. They have primary responsibility to deal with religious freedom issues. So they are reaching out to the religious groups that face restrictions on their rights. And the religious groups said, we never had anyone to talk to before. We never had anyone to turn to for help. Now, we all know the person in the United States Embassy that we can go to when problems arise. And these 200 people this year have to immerse themselves and speak with the religious communities and to the government to get the government's response that we insist has to be in the reports as well, to give them a fair chance to explain and set context to some of the actions that on the face of it might appear to be discriminatory, but they may have a perfectly plausible explanation for, and they have a right to be heard on this. And they get grounded in this issue. And there were 200 this year, and 200 last year, and 200 the year before that. Some of those are the same, but many are new. In the 17 years of our annual report, there are probably 2,000 Foreign Service officers that have had to engage with this issue. Many of them have moved up the ladder to be ambassadors or deputy chiefs of mission, the number 2 person in these embassies. That is really an extraordinary impact in changing the culture of the Foreign Service in a way to understand what the plight of persecuted religious minorities are, the challenges they face, and what might be done to help them. Secondly, we use our diplomatic leverage. Here, the Secretary of State designates countries which having the kind of the most problematic, engaged in systemic, ongoing, egregious violations of religious freedom as countries of particular concern. If they're designated that, they may be subject to sanctions, economic sanctions, to other diplomatic steps being taken. Currently, there are 10 CPC countries: Burma, China, Eritrea, Iran, North Korea, Saudi Arabia, Sudan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, and Uzbekistan. Now, third, we dedicate significant resources and support for these communities. I'm proud that over the 22 months that I've been at the State Department, with the support of a bipartisan coalition on Capitol Hill and the support of the Secretary, the size of this office has doubled. The programmatic resources have increased sixfold, from $3.2 million a year to $20 million a year, which gives us the resources to do things that really can be of help in building interfaith coalitions to confront religious bigotry in a country or to help deal with conflict situations. Take, for example, the efforts of interfaith coalitional leaders in Central African Republic, where Christian militias and Muslim militias have been fighting with each other. And there have been some extraordinary interfaith efforts that are the kind that we would support. And that have helped quell some of this violence. And the same is true in Pakistan and other countries across the globe, where there have been instances where the intervention of these interfaith coalitions really have made a significant difference in stopping some of the violence that takes place. Since the creation of this office 18 years ago, scores of millions of dollars have been poured into these kinds of efforts, either rule of law efforts or these specifically aimed at religious tolerance, religious cooperation, and makes a huge difference in the lives of many of those who are seeking help from the international community. Fourth, we actively engage with other countries to work together here. I've met with countless government officials, parliamentarians, human rights activists, religious leaders, academics, journalists, believers from a vast array of religious tradition, as well as skeptics and non-believers, consistently press governments to increase protection for the right of all people to enjoy religious freedom. We've put together a coalition of 60 parliamentary caucuses around the world and a group of 30 nations in the executive branch, my counterparts, who want to work together in order to have a multiplier effect by coordinating our efforts. And this has been a major improvement in the last few years on the international scene. We also travel extensively. In the 22 months I've been there, I've traveled to 30 countries to meet with government officials, the Justice Ministry, the Religious Ministry, or the Committee on Religious Affairs, the Interior Ministry, the Security Ministry. You wouldn't think the Security Ministry might be involved, but in some ways it's the most, in authoritarian governments, the Security Ministry is often the most influential ministry. Any other ministry wants to do something, if the Security Ministry doesn't want it, it's not going to happen. And therefore, I've gone out of my way to try and meet whenever possible with the heads of the security ministries to reassure them that their needs can be met, even with granting more freedom and more opportunity for the religious communities to function in their country. And I'll give you a clear example of that in just a few moments. Look, there are many countries around the world where religious freedom flourishes. The Pew research arm does a religious landscape every year. It is determined by the criteria it uses that about a quarter of the country have very serious restrictions on religious freedom, either because the government restricts religious freedom or there's sectarian violence between different groups, and the majority usually is oppressing the minority. And the government doesn't act to protect the minority. So that's their definition of a serious infringement on religious freedom. The problem is that some of the largest countries in the world are in the 24% of the countries that have egregious, serious problems. So China, for its own governmental action, India, because of sectarian strife, Pakistan, because of sectarian strife, are in that list. And that means that 3/4 of the population of the world live in countries that have serious restrictions on religious freedom. Here, obviously, one of the greatest threats we face today is the rise of the non-state actors, ISIL, Boko Haram, Al-Shabaab, but also militant Buddhist groups in Burma, militant Hindu groups in India, the Christian militias in the Central African Republic, extremist Jews on the West Bank in Israel. There are extremist forces in almost every one of the major religions and some of the smaller religions as well. And by extremist here, as opposed to moderate religions, I don't care about theology. I don't care how liberal the theology of a religious group or how fundamentalist the theology of a religious group is. The sole question here is, are they willing to reject the use of force to impose their religious views on others? Are they willing to let those who disagree with them live freely or not? That's really the test. And all those that say yes to that, no matter what their theology, have a common interest to try and weaken and delegitimize the extremists who are willing to use force. Whether that force comes in the form of governmental force, blasphemy laws, apostasy laws that I'll address in a moment, or non-state actors. And we are spending enormous resources across the globe to try and defeat these non-state actors. That seems to be an equal opportunity terrorist group and targeted everyone, including Iraqi religious minorities, other Muslims, people perceived to be LGBTI, journalists, professional women. But this horrific and tragic case is only one of the most vulnerable here. And their willingness to use rape, sexual violence, forced marriages, forced conversions, beheadings, ethnic cleansing, so that there's nobody left under their control who really holds different religious views than what they think the truthful view is, led the secretary to find that this was genocide against the Yazidis, the Christians, and the Shia in Iraq, and it was crimes against humanity or ethnic cleansing against all the other minority groups. These are minority groups that had lived there for centuries, sometimes for millennia, being forced out of their historic homelands. Now we're moving back in militarily, and the central challenge for us is, what can we do to make it possible for those groups that have been forced out to return safely to their homes? And think about it a minute. In order to do that, you need to deal with the following issues. First, until it's safe to go home, they need to be protected in refugee camps or supported in new communities they've settled to a degree that they have adequate schools for their kids, adequate health care, adequate standard of living, that they're not going to just abandon it all and become refugees. Secondly, those who do become refugees, we have a moral obligation and a legal obligation to ensure that that refugee status is fully protected and it results in real opportunities to be resettled in an area of safety. Third, they're not going to go home unless there's security they can count on. If you remember what happened in Mosul, large Christian community there, and the other minorities, the Shabak and the Mandians, and all of those that live there were told by the Iraqi government and the Peshmerga, don't worry about it, we'll stop ISIL. And overnight they fled, leaving these people victimized by ISIL. And many people had to flee, leaving their possessions behind, often without their documents, which greatly complicated their lives. They had to flee in massive numbers to avoid being captured by ISIL. So there has to be a security system that they really can count on and that they'll trust. That means some of their own local defense forces have to be integrated into that security structure. They have to have some governance. So they're part of the decision whether people are going to flee or not flee. Fourth, there has to be accountability, that those people who worked with ISIL, who helped and cooperated with ISIL, are going to be held accountable for the genocidal activity that took place, for the ethnic cleansing that took place. Fifth, there has to be transitional justice. Even where people didn't actively support them, people are going to go home to their communities, the minorities, and they're going to find people who took over their houses, their businesses, sometimes invested money in their businesses. How do you sort that out in a way that doesn't descend into people taking revenge, that won't devolve into sectarian violence again that existed before ISIL came and now would be exacerbated as people try to push out the people who took over homes and businesses? What's the legal mechanism and what are the modalities of reconciliation that can help heal the wounds in such situations? That has to be developed, and you have to have economic development. In other words, people aren't going to go home if they're not in the utility system that's functioning in the villages that were abandoned. If there aren't schools for their kids, if there isn't health care for their families, they're not going to go home. So somebody has to figure out how that's happening. And the United States has been a driving force in putting together a coalition to get donor countries around the world to make clear pledges. We just held a conference a few months ago in which we raised another $2 billion in pledges, and that was followed up by a conference which my office ran for 30-odd other countries to talk about specific commitments. One of the good things the UN has done, it's never done this before, it is allowing both private groups and governments to take on specific projects rather than dumping their money into the UN relief funds. UN relief funds are the most experienced in the world. They know how to use the money wisely, but we have found when donors, like in private charities, you find this here at the university, when donors can pick where their money is going to go and feel a sense of ownership and interest in nurturing that process, they're more likely to invest than just giving to a general fund. And now we're trying it for the first time here, so that if someone wants to build a hospital in the community, with some country, they'll do it. The Italian police have taken over training police in the areas that people are going to go home to. Other countries have taken the responsibility to help rebuild the utility system, the water and electricity in certain areas of the country. So we're mapping this out, but it is a huge undertaking. And then finally, there has to be changes in Iraq's policy to assume, as Prime Minister Abadi has said he wants here, to ensure minorities will have a much bigger say in shaping the future of Iraq than they did under the Morsi government. I didn't say Morsi. Here under the government before the current government. Here, we also this year we really focused on blasphemy laws and apostasy laws. Now, blasphemy laws, I think you know, is legislation punishing irreverent or disrespect towards religious, holy personages, religious artifacts, customs, beliefs. Apostasy laws criminalize the abandonment or renunciation of one set of religious beliefs and adopting another. Actually, you don't even need the second part of it. Abandoning religious beliefs that have the support of government will constitute a violation of apostasy laws. And you know what? One of the most common responses I get when I travel and I talk about blasphemy laws punish people for simply expressing their heartfelt criticism of religion or differences with religion. Sometimes, some religions, the very statement of the core beliefs of that religion, such as, for example, that Ahmadiyya Muslim beliefs that Muhammad was not the last prophet. That is regarded as blasphemous by the majority Sunni tradition in the world. But to the Ahmadiyya, it is a simple statement of what they believe. And they can be, in a number of countries, arrested, punished, sentenced to death. In 12 countries, blasphemy can be punished by death. And this has a chilling impact on the religious life of minorities who might express the disagreements with people. And you know what? The biggest pushback I get when I raise this issue with government officials in other countries, an inherent violation of the promise of freedom of speech, freedom of expression, religious freedom, they'll say, yeah, well, how about the 6 states in the United States that still have blasphemy laws? Like those far-out states like Massachusetts still has blasphemy laws on the books. And, you know, it's true they can't be enforced under our Constitution. Supreme Court ruled on that in the 1950s. But it is an embarrassment. Of the quarter of the countries of the world that have blasphemy laws, probably a third of them don't enforce it. But the fact that they have it justifies the countries that do enforce it to hold their own as well. So maybe some of you might want to take a look at the blasphemy laws that exist here in Massachusetts and see what might be done to get the state to set a precedent for Michigan, Oklahoma, South Carolina, Wyoming, and Pennsylvania, the other 5 states that have blasphemy laws on the books. Here, so this is a central challenge for us, and we're working very hard to put on right now the most famous victim of blasphemy laws in the world, Asia Bibi, a Christian woman who lives in Pakistan, was arrested 6 years ago here when some of the very prominent figures in Pakistan stood up against blasphemy laws and on behalf of her calling for her release, including the National Minister of National Minorities, a friend of mine, Shahbaz Bhatti, and a very respected governor, Salman Taseer, spoke out. They were both assassinated. Here, so, and, you know, it's not just that you can say things that will be blasphemous to someone else, it's that you're also subject, so long as those laws exist, to the plague of false accusations. People want to settle a personal grudge with you by accusing you of blasphemy. Or they're in a business dispute and they want to get land and force you to sell it and you won't sell it. And they'll accuse you of blasphemy, you get arrested and you need the money and you're forced to sell. Or members of a family of one religion whose daughter runs off with a son of a family of another religion, and they're angry at that family and they accuse them of blasphemy. And the Supreme Court of Pakistan has boldly said in the clearest possible way that Pakistan has a legal obligation to protect religious minorities, and including to protect them against false accusations of blasphemy. Now, the Pakistan government has made some improvements in this, and that's encouraging. They are beginning to enforce those laws and to punish people who make these false accusations. But there are still, this past year, another 36 people were arrested, and there are countries across the globe where large numbers of people get arrested, in Sudan, in Egypt, in other countries where there's very active implementation of blasphemy laws. So let me conclude with giving you a real-life example, because we are gathered here in terms of my work, that is the work of my office on behalf of religious freedom, and the work of the United States State Department and the Secretary of State. This is an extraordinary week. It's an extraordinary week because of what's happening in Vietnam, a very influential country that has had a very oppressive regime that represents a lot of problems that religious groups have in other countries. First, it is a very strict registration system. Very hard to register your religion. If you function non-registered, and some do it because they can't get registered, some do it because it's a matter of religious belief. They don't think the government ought to register religious groups, and some of the Baptist groups just won't register. And if you function without registration, you can have your church closed down, you can have your mosque shut down, you can have your pagoda taken away from you, you can end up in jail if you're the religious leader of a community. So this is a very serious struggle for people. So you have that. And to be recognized, which gives you real freedom to function safely, not easily, but safely, it takes 25 years under the laws that exist today. 25 years of functioning there. You're often a catch-22 because you try to get registered, and if you're not registered, but you want to get moving on your 25-year period, you can get arrested for functioning without, because you're functioning without registration. And then they have an approval system. That is, everything a church, mosque, pagoda, Hindu temple wants to do, they have to go ask permission of 3 levels of government. And if they don't give you the permission, if they turn you down, you theoretically can't function. You may do it anyway and take the risk, but you're subject to arrest, fines, imprisonment, shutting down of the house of worship, etc. So there's a whole slew of law, and you have to do that year after year. So, you have to go and say, this year we want to have Easter services. We'd like approval. We want to have Sunday morning services. We want to have Friday prayers at the mosque. We want to celebrate Ramadan. We want to celebrate the Hindu holiday this year, the central holiday of Diwali. I'm here, you come in and you ask for permission. 3 levels, local, regional, national government has to approve. It ties the religious communities up in knots. Many groups never get permission to register a function here, and they have to choose between risking going to prison and following their faith and worshiping God the way that they believe in. So this is an enormous challenge. So they passed a new constitution. That constitution required writing basic laws on every aspect of their legal system: criminal justice, the penal code, labor law, disability law, education law, and religion law, and a whole bunch of other basic laws, which they've been busy in the last 3 years in doing this. And now this month, they're going to vote on their law on protests and their law on religion. And when they began the law, it did not improve the situation one iota. They dropped that 25-year recognition requirement down to 10 years. We don't think there ought to be any wait here, but that was the only improvement. Other than that, there was not one single improvement. But then they did something that was really quite remarkable. They decided to have a transparent process. They published a law. They welcomed international feedback. They welcomed feedback from their own religious communities. Here, they got massive criticism of the law, and they began to make changes through the second draft and the third draft and the fourth draft, and they published that one. And they got more feedback. We were there at the time the first one was released, and I was speaking at our annual Human Rights Dialogue, offered a number of criticisms, and they said, I offered to put together a team of international lawyers. They accepted it, and those international lawyers, once they were set up, they went on their own. We didn't do anything to control what they said or what they did here, and they listened to them. They met with the executive branch and the legislative branch people who were dealing with this. And step by step, this became better. On a scale of 0, North Korea, the most repressive country in the world, to, let's say, the United States standard, this will take us from 20% on that scale to about 60% on that scale. There's still serious problems left in Vietnam, and we have to deal with that, but it will be light years different, and they deserve a lot of credit for that. They really do. For the first time, you used to, if you wanted to send a kid to seminary, you needed vetting and approval by the government. You wanted to ordain that kid, vetting and approval by the government. You want to hire that priest or imam, vetting and approval by government. The bishop wanted to move the priest around to meet the demographic changes in the diocese. You needed the vetting and the approval of the government. Everything had to be approved by the government. And one of the reasons they claim was for security reasons, that there were elements out and around the country, particularly in the ethnic communities, who had fought with the United States against the communist government, and they still resented it, and they wanted to break away, and they wanted to have autonomy here, and it would lead to agitation if you gave them too much freedom. I mean, all of these kinds of concerns, and the security forces had to know what they were going on. Now, we think you don't report to the government what religious communities have to do. We think that's part of religious freedom. But they're where they are. And so we made recommendations that understood where they were. And again, in keeping with my practice of reaching out to the Ministry of Security, met with the Minister of Security 3 times here to make the obvious point. If you drop the approval system and you go to a notification system, that is, the religious community can do what they want. They just have to notify you. No approval necessary. Here, you'll know everything you now know. You're not going to know one thing more, keeping the approval system, than you know through a notification system. But the most burdensome impact on religion will be alleviated. They've made a number of shifts over to that. They're going to make a decision this week whether or not another recommendation that came from their religious communities and the international community was was the question of if the government didn't respond by the date that the law said, it would constitute formal approval. And they're leaning towards, they're going to make a judgment about that. At first, they didn't respond on that. Now, they've explicitly grappled with it, and that might be a big thing. They're allowed now to have legal personality. Religious groups can be incorporated and open bank accounts, which will make things much easier for the religious community. There's a whole slew of changes. Not perfect, but again, the United States is not perfect. It's not perfect. But boy, it will be light years away from where it was. This is being voted on this week as we gather here. It'll be voted on Thursday. And we're going to see, whether or not this country will now be a model for other countries in terms of how to meet a whole bunch of needs that they perceive that they need in a way that will greatly ease the restrictions on religious freedom in the country. Here, and our engagement with the Committee on Religious Affairs, their openness to meet with us and to listen to us was one piece of that. They actually took a delegation over to meet with us about 2 months ago to assess the latest drafts with us. That's an engagement we've never had before. Now, one of the driving forces in that was probably that we really wanted the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, the TPP agreement that looks now like it's not going to pass. And I don't know whether that will have an effect on the vote on Thursday. I pray not. A great deal of effort into bringing along the process as far as it is in a way that meets their security needs and still gives significantly more freedom to the religious communities. And if it passes this way, we're going to be rolling that out as a model for other countries around the world that have the same kind of restrictions that they had. So this is a very exciting kind of moment for us here. We are at this point, on the cusp of recognizing what a difficult time this is, and yet how much we're able to do here. Religious freedom and human rights are not in the ascendancy in the world right now. But our job is to do the best we can and to speak out and put markers down and hold people accountable for religious oppression and persecution. And to do everything possible to invest in structures in the society that will enhance the rule of law, enhance protections of minority communities. And we will continue to work in that. So for the Rohingya in Burma, for the Baha'is in Iran, for the Shia Muslims in Malaysia and in Saudi Arabia, for the Jewish community and the Muslim communities of Europe who have been so victimized by the growth in anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, forms of anti-Semitism that we never thought we would see again in the end of World War II, attacks on synagogues, attacks on Jews in the street. And so too, the vast majority of people in the Muslim community clearly reject what the extremists do, but they get targeted as an entire group because of what the few do. And, one of the great mistakes of human history is the tendency to blame the group for the sins of the few here. And that has been the source of much suffering and much evil in the world. And we're seeing it vividly in terms of the treatment of the Muslim community in too many places across the globe. So our job is to speak out for all of these groups and do everything we can to make life better, step by step, for each of the groups. We do it because of our values. We do it because of our interests. But most of all, we do it because of these billions and billions of God's children who are being punished simply because they want to worship God in their own way. And they're imprisoned, tortured, abused, persecuted, simply because their way of worshiping God, which doesn't infringe on anyone else's, is offensive to whoever has the majority, whoever has the power. All of human rights is asserting the right of an individual against the group, against the state. And those fundamental rights enshrined in our founding documents and more importantly in these international treaties if we're ever going to have a world in which people can really live in comity and cooperation with each other, it will only happen when those promises of religious freedom and other human rights become the reality of the world. I'm proud of the role that the United States plays in leading the world to confront human rights abuses, confront religious freedom abuses, and I will continue to work as long as I'm at the State Department, and even when I'm no longer at the State Department, I'm going to continue to work to do everything possible to actually fulfill those rights and those dreams of those who suffer from persecution. I would simply conclude by saying, if these kinds of things are of interest to you, there are great opportunities for people to be involved in these battles professionally as the years go on. As foreign service officers in the State Department, as civil service officers at various places in government, as active professionals or volunteers with human rights groups that support religious freedom and human rights across the globe. If ever there were a time to speak out on these issues, it's now, and we need your voices, we need your involvement, and we hope some of you will be inspired enough to actually make this a career. There's a phrase in my own tradition that says, you and I together, we can change the world. And I truly believe that. You and I, each other, and good people like you, all over the country, all over the world, you are capable of changing the world, but each person has to do their part. Thank you very much. Questions? Okay. All right, so let's open it up to questions, comments, arguments, whatever you want. So who's going to, yes. I always love it when someone shoots a hand. Usually people say, and then as soon as the first hand goes up, then everyone else's does. So thank you. Go ahead. We get challenged by people saying, look, you got your own problems. And we do. We have conflicts over religion in this country. And you know, the debate of the last election campaign is a topic. We always get asked about, about that. One of the things we point out is, first of all, in the Muslim countries, I make the point that the Muslim communities in America are the most integrated, the most able to participate fully in the educational, economic, and cultural life of our country, of any other country in the world, according to the Pew surveys and the Gallup surveys, much better able to participate in the fullness of American life than in any other country where they're a minority. Because it's often the Muslim countries who are pushing back on these issues because of the nature of the debates in the last presidential election, et cetera. The other thing I would point out is people say things in an election campaigns that don't necessarily mark what they will actually try to legislate. And we're going to see to what extent the new administration takes seriously the values that are at the core of what America has always been about, and I'm hopeful that they will rise to the occasion in terms of embracing those values. I know that there will be a lot of good people appointed to the administration. They may not agree with the particular policy positions some of you might hold. I may not agree with the policy positions that I hold, but a lot of these are people of goodwill who want to make the world a better place and are seeking to do that. And are open to dialogue and finding common ground wherever possible. Third, whoever became president, Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump, whoever it was who became president, whatever they said in the campaign, when they become president, they're bound by the Constitution of the United States. And one of the core features of our constitutional system is there are classes of protected groups, and that includes religious groups, groups of national origin, racial groups in the country, gender groups in the country that are entitled to equal protection under the law and under the law. You cannot treat one group, as a whole group, differently than you treat the other similarly situated groups here. So, I count and trust on the constitutional system to continue to protect the rights, particularly of minorities. It's always been that way. There may be There may be setbacks in the process of doing that, but eventually, as Dr. King said, the arc of history is long, but it bends towards justice. Here, eventually, we are going to continue to see in the sweep of American history the movement towards equality being a reality for minority groups, and you can all help speed up the day when that progress we've made actually tips the scales in a way that becomes the norm without regard to any of the protected categories that you care about or that the country has held are entitled to the protection of law. So I get pushback all the time on it. Now, as for the other disputes on religious freedom, and make it up into the courts here, putting aside the election campaign, here the claims between religious claims and the claims against discrimination of other protected groups, reproductive rights issues, LGBT issues, etc. Can people who have religious objections to a particular group playing a certain role, can they be exempt from laws that bar discrimination against a protected category? So if someone has a religious objection to baking a cake for a gay couple being married, does that religious exemption protect them? Good people can differ on that, and good people do differ on that. In the main, the courts have held overwhelmingly, with almost no exceptions, whenever that avoiding discrimination against protected categories is a compelling interest, and the universal application of the law is a sufficiently narrow application of that compelling interest, that the religious claims lose. Here, now, you may be bothered by that. The Catholic Church has, as a formal institution, has qualms with some of those findings. The very complicated issues of they want to place kids through orphanages that the Catholic Church runs into foster homes or homes for adoption. Are they forced by the law to treat gay couples exactly the same as other couples? These are very difficult questions, and good moral people can differ on these issues. These are important questions. Do not mistake them, as important as they are. As important as the values are, do not mistake them for the kinds of issues that we're dealing with, where people are put into prison and tortured and raped and forced to convert and beheaded and forced to marry and forced to bear children out of these rapes that they did not want to have here, and by the rapists and who won't let them go here, whose lives are being destroyed by the persecution that they face. I pray for the day when the kind of work I have to do on the global level is the good faith differences that I was describing we're involved with here in the United States. Those are important issues, but we're at the business of literally saving lives, saving entire communities from being ethnically cleansed and wiped out because of their religious beliefs, protecting people from torture and abuse, etc. So these are important debates we have here, but they're not the debates that we're engaged with across the world. Yes. Yeah, fascinating intellectual debate, and one that obviously has political resonance to it. The Obama administration doesn't want to do anything that would suggest that Islam itself is inherently a terrorist entity, or the Islamic community is inherently terrorist. So it tries to avoid that kind of rhetoric here. But when you listen to, if you ask people, what do you mean by an Islamic terrorist? People advocate for it. Think about the answer you get. Well, somebody that uses Islam here to justify violent action against people who differ with them, with no regard to human rights, willing to kill innocent civilians and men, women, and children based on doing it. It is exactly verbatim the language the president uses. So he's not using a term, but when you ask people to define what that term means, unless they disagree with what his concern is and try to argue all Muslims are terrorists, Islam is inherently a terrorist enterprise here. If that's what they believe, then there's no agreement with what the president is trying to make in the point of not using that. But if you ask them, that's not what they mean, and they mean something along the lines that I said. If you ask them to define it, they will define it in the exact words that the president has used over and over again in lieu of using that, so there'll be no misunderstanding about exactly what he's trying to convey about doing it. So, that's it is a fascinating debate that's going on about this, but we shouldn't lose sight of stepping back and understanding that what the people want from that is mostly exactly what the president is doing, and that is to actually describe the actions and how religion is being used to justify immoral actions by these people. Okay? Okay. Others? Yes? Here. Vietnam is a beautiful country. The people are beautiful people. I really have enjoyed being there. I just came back from a 3.5-week trip from Cuba, which now we've reestablished diplomatic relations with. I went and spent a good deal of time with the Cardinal, talking about the very real challenges that he faces, but also the freedoms that he does have, and we want to do everything we can to ease the remaining restrictions that he faces, such as building new churches. Almost impossible to build a new church, a new mosque, a new house of worship in Cuba. The only group, there's one of the Baptist strands who seemed out in the rural areas, functioning in a lot of the rural areas, who seem to do better in the western part of the country than others do in being able to build new churches. But in general, every group is restricted, and it's been really frustrating for the Cardinal, to not to be able to build churches. It's frustrating for the leader of any community not to be able to build houses of worship as they're needed. That's an example of what we were doing there, and got to meet with some of the smaller minority communities there as well. Went to England for a week to deal with a conference that brought religious leading advocates from around the leading religious freedom advocates from all over the world to talk about the connection of religious freedom and CVE, combating violent extremism. A fascinating conference. Some of the best thinkers on these issues gathered together for 2 intensive days, hosted by the Foreign Ministry of Great Britain. Here, and was very honored to give a speech to the British caucus on religious freedom in the Parliament. What's called the All-Party Caucus. They are representatives of different parties, who have about 60 of them now, who have joined the British Parliament caucus on religious freedom. And then went to Indonesia. That is one of the most interesting countries. A long tradition of a moderate Islam that syncretically integrates what they call local wisdom, a lot of indigenous customs into Islam, and they are feeling, like many Muslim countries and non-Muslim countries, a bit buffeted by the growth of Wahhabism and Salafist Islam, and they've decided to push back not just by defending themselves from violent acts of any of these groups, but to take the offensive in terms of the intellectual debate, and to actually take their more moderate form of Islam and to go out and promulgate it here, and to kind of pit that vision against some of the more extremist interpretations of Islam. President al-Sisi in Egypt has done something very similar there, calling on Al-Azhar, the great university of Muslim thought, and the Fatwa institution there, to push back hard against extremist interpretations too. I commend him for that. Obviously, we have serious concerns about the restrictions on civil society that he's implemented and the cracking down on dissent that he has implemented has greatly weakened the structure of human rights in the country. But at least he's trying to push back with his understanding of what traditional Islam stands for in a way that would delegitimize these extremist interpretations. It's a fascinating debate going on. And then I was in Malaysia here. So someone has to do the tough work here, and it felt that in addition to going to Aceh province in Indonesia, where Sharia law has been implemented in a much more tolerant form I mean, there are problems with it, but much more tolerant form than you'll find like in Saudi Arabia or the Maldives here, because they've clarified this last summer that Sharia law will not apply to non-Muslims and will not apply to Muslims who don't live in Aceh province. If they're visiting from somewhere else, they're under the secular legal system of the country. So there are still problems. I mean, dissenters, Muslim dissenters who live in Aceh province still face restrictions on religious freedom, violation of their conscience. But, you know, it's a fascinating thing. But the tough thing was somebody had to go check in with the Hindu community in Bali. And I volunteered here, one of the most beautiful places on earth, here, and spent a couple of days actually in fascinating discussions with the Bali thing. And in 22 months, I took my first day off on one of these trips for personal purposes. Here, and we went on an eco bike tour for all over the Bali island, and it was really as beautiful as people have always said it was. So that will probably remain in my mind one of my favorite days there. But, you know, the truth is, it is such an extraordinary thing to meet with these persecuted groups and to have this sense just flow from them of appreciation that someone hasn't forgotten them, that someone knows and has lifted up their story and what it means to them, how empowering it is, and the sense of thanks they have here. You know, an extraordinary day where I was in a courtroom in Khartoum when the two most prominent religious prisoners of conscience were released after we had been advocating for a long time. Nobody else was really focused on this, but we had been actively advocating and working with our friends in our interlocutors in the Sudanese government. The world community had focused on a similar incident a year and a half before with Miriam Ibrahim, who was a Christian woman who was accused of blasphemy. And the courts let her go. And here, too, the court decided to drop all the charges, all the felony charges against these two pastors, convicted them of a minor misdemeanor charge, and reduced it to time served on the basis that the judge said the Quran demands compassion in such a case where people are acting in accordance with their conscience. It was an extraordinary moment for us. And then, of course, sadly, after they fled the country, they left the country to safety in Kenya, the government actually restored charges against them. But it was done after they had left. And that, you know, there are extraordinary moments like that where we work to get religious prisoners of conscience out that are truly memorable. And very often with the help of people like you around the country who advocate and write letters to the governments of those countries and you know, help provide support for the families of those who have been incarcerated because of blasphemy charges. Asia Bibi will be going before the Supreme Court very soon in Pakistan. We are very hopeful they will finally, after all these years, drop the charges against it and let her out of the country, let her out, and she would leave the country at this point, et cetera. That will be a very gratifying moment for us. Yes. The controversy of the Palestinian-Israeli crisis does come up, particularly in a number of the Muslim countries here. I wouldn't say it complicates it, but I'm asked about it a lot. And, you know, I give a straightforward answer. The United States government policy is a two-state solution. It wants to guarantee that there'll be a viable, full Palestinian state on the West Bank, and that Israel will be able to exist behind secure borders as a Jewish state. That has been our position all along, and we've been critical of both sides when they've done things to undercut the effort to reach accommodation and reach a peace settlement here. And most people don't give me pushback on that. They accept that it's kind of matter of fact, and we go on to the next topic. My being Jewish and a rabbi is interesting. In the main, it has been a plus. Because when I'm meeting with Muslim leaders, and I taught Jewish law for decades at Georgetown Law School, and I've written about Jewish perspectives on contemporary issues here, from perspectives from Jewish law on contemporary issues. So when I'm meeting with Muslim leaders, we'll very often, and this on one level drives the State Department officials a little bit crazy, because I represent the United States government. I don't represent the Jewish community. I'm not there on an intellectual exercise. I'm there or discourse or with the other side. I'm there representing the public policy of the government. But I have found one of the best ways to actually engage Muslim leaders or Hindu leaders or Buddhist leaders is actually to get into a substantive conversation on things that they're interested about. Well, I'll share what American law says where it's relevant on issues, but also what the Jewish tradition has to say about it. We get into fascinating conversations. I end up with meetings longer than any American officials get with some of these, the Minister of Islamic Affairs in a country, because we get off in these conversations and it changes the whole tone of the meeting. I ran into the problem for the first time in 22 months in Indonesia when some of the conservative newspapers ran kind of this headline story about United States sends prominent rabbi to talk about religious freedom. Here, it wasn't a horrible article, but it's the first time I can remember that it was ever raised in a public way about it. I mean, when I walk into a government office anywhere, they know who I am. They've read my bio. They've read some of my writings sometimes. But this was the first time it got out in the press as the filter through which they presented my being there, rather than U.S. Ambassador of Religious Freedom, or U.S. Ambassador comes to talk about religious freedom or human rights, or however it gets phrased in the paper. There was no resonance to it. A couple of people asked me questions in the next couple of talks for the next day or two. It happened on the third day of a 9-day trip there, and it was just the first time it's come up. So I'm in China. The Chinese government had asked me to come over so that I could see for myself that things were not as bad as we have described in our annual report, or that the popular press in the West describes China as being. And so we didn't push the envelope. We had been trying to get into China, and at the Human Rights Dialogue, they made a point of urging me to come. So they wanted to show me some of the good things, and, that's one, for instance, where it's a Catholic institution in Hebei province. It's the largest concentration of Catholics, here. And the Religious Affairs Ministry, regional ministry, actually has a very good relationship with the Catholic community there and gives them a lot of leeway to do this stuff. So they have a publishing house, they run social service programs that are very hard for others to run in different areas, and it's very encouraging to see what happens when there's a little bit of freedom. In Shanghai, there's a little bit more openness than some of the other ones, although in the last year and a half or 2 years, they've begun to crack down a little more in Shanghai. They have been doing well for a while, and then just about 2 years ago, it began to be reversed. But there are provinces, there's not one policy for every province. And so you do see some differences. So switch gears to a city called Wenzhou, which is the highest concentration of Protestants in the country. And there are hundreds and hundreds of churches in this area. It is a very upper middle class Protestant community here that had done very well, very integrated into life there. And about 2 years ago, they began tearing down crosses on churches. All right, so I kind of played by their rules. Saw all the good things they wanted, and we asked to see some of the areas we knew were problem areas, and they generally let it. But when I wanted to go to Wenzhou, they wouldn't let me go because there had been a typhoon that had gone through, and they were arguing that there was a prediction of another typhoon and it wouldn't be safe for me to go. So this controversy has gathered world attention here, and I couldn't get in. They did allow me to go and meet with the regional authorities, who are the ones who have been taking down the crosses, authorizing them to take down. And a group of the more prominent human rights lawyers and pastors from Wenzhou decided to come over to where I was. And the night before they came, they got arrested. All of them. The most famous human rights, religious rights lawyer in the country disappeared for 4 months. No one knew where he was being held. No lawyers, no family, no anything, what we call black arrests there. They're often held in motel rooms where they're totally isolated from the system. They're not registered anywhere, et cetera. And this heroic guy, months later, all of a sudden appears on television and confesses to whatever crimes and then the next day he's let go. So we don't know exactly what led it, but this was not friendly persuasion. Here, a real tragedy here. And a couple of these people still have outstanding crimes. So I'm sitting at a conference on what we're going to do with for the refugees from Syria in Paris a week later, and I'm sitting next to the deputy foreign minister. He says, "You ever been to China?" I said, "Yeah, I'm glad you asked. I was just there." And what happened, those arrests led to stories in newspapers across the world, editorials in the Washington Post and the Wall Street Journal condemning China and urging that these people be let go. Here, so I said, "Yes, as a matter of fact, I was just there." Here, and he said, "Well, did you have a good experience?" I said, "I saw many positive things, and I would have been willing to talk about those here, but you wiped it out because you arrested 10 prominent people." He said, "Oh, you're that guy here," and you know, it was really a tragedy what happened. I was hoping it would finish out on a good note, and the next time I'd make a request to get into Tibet and into the area where the Uyghur Muslims are, who are two large communities victimized by particular persecution in China. So that's an example of where they wouldn't let me go. And yes, there are times that people say, "We don't want to meet with you. It's too dangerous." And there have been times, and this is a terrible feeling for me, where I have met with people, and then afterwards they've been called in for questioning, harassed, held in detention for a day or two, never longer than that, and wanting to know from the local authorities, what were we talking about, what did we say. I actually assumed and tell the people when I meet with them, you should assume this is being recorded. Here apparently wasn't in the areas where we were, so they were arresting these people to find out, and they harassed the wife of one of the leading prisoners of conscience, a pastor in the Central Highlands, and his wife and children have been harassed for months now, and not related to our visit. But the harassment began. They tried to prevent her from getting to me here, and they turned her around, took away her bicycle, her motorbike, and sent her home here. So we got in the car, and when we called her and said, "Do you want us to come?" So we went, and they weren't going to stop us from going. So we went to her house and met her there. It's always a dance. You never want to do anything. We don't do anything that will endanger the people here. We always let them make the decision. Do they want us to talk about this story publicly? Do they not? Do they want us to issue a press release about it? Do they not? Do they want us to meet with us, or do they not? Whatever they want, we will honor. We never put anyone at risk beyond what they, in their free will, are willing to decide that we ought to do. What was the other variant of what you asked? The second one was also interesting. Yeah, I mean, those are the examples. And, talking about danger, there are certain countries, Pakistan, Iraq, that kind of thing, where it's like a scene out of Homeland, or something. You're in armored, cavalcade of armored SUVs, armed troops up front, medical van in the back, coordinated people watching for any suspicious activity, or always altering the route in different places here. So there are just times where you're in a dangerous situation, and you just have to be really careful about what you're doing. Much more from obviously non-state forces than from the government forces in these cases. But you're treading near ISIL-held territory in Iraq, and you never know, and you're just going to run into an IED or run into things. Actually, precautions that they take even on the IEDs that are pretty amazing about how they deal with some of that. Anyway, here I want to thank you all. It's been fun for me to have the opportunity, and I hope our paths continue to cross.